Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Bones and Stones. Today, we're joined by Courtney Hopper from the University of Toronto. She's busy finishing off her PhD research. And not too long ago, she presented at SAFA, the Society of Africanist Archaeologists, where she presented a really interesting talk. And that's why she's kindly agreed to join us today and have a chat with us. This is going to be a very difficult conversation to have with the two Matts. So I'm just going to give them a little bit of background. Guys, we're talking about pottery today. Now, pottery is something it's earthenware pottery we're talking about. So it's something made from clay and so on. And you can put things in it. Okay. I know the earlier Stone Age dudes didn't have this. Okay. But like, I'm sure you'll grasp the topic as we move along, right?
What's clay? What's clay?
It's so you're
Clay?
gonna love clay. You're gonna love it. I'm gonna bring some to your house. Sorry, Courtney. We always have to give each other a bit of trouble when we talk about different time periods. But thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, your talk was really interesting. It was titled Organic Residue Analysis of Later Stone Age Pottery from the Namaqualand Coastal Desert of South Africa. I don't want to give anything away, so perhaps could you just give us a little bit of a summary about the work that you've been doing?
Sure. Specifically about this paper, I assume.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. About your PhD as well. You know, we can dance between the two of them.
Sure. So really my kind of the broad theme of my doctoral research is trying to better understand or see herders, later Stone Age herders in the archaeological record of northwestern South Africa, so Namaqualand. And they're quite elusive in the archaeological record, as I assume most people, or at least who work in the later Stone Age, know. And so it's just, I'm trying to find new or apply different methods to identify them. So if we don't have sheep bones at a site, does that automatically mean that these people weren't herders who occupied the site? So I'm trying to kind of understand that by taking a different lens. So the paper I presented at SAFA was specifically about the lipids that are preserved inside the pottery. And so we collected, or I sampled from the University of Cape Town's collections, about 78 pottery chunks or sherds, and sent those off to the University of Bristol for my collaborator, Dr. Julie Dunn, to analyze. We found, I guess the big reveal is, unfortunately, at least for the sites we sampled, the pots did not contain milk. So we can't definitively say that if there's no sheep bones or cattle bones or any domesticate bones, at least for those sites, we couldn't ascribe them to herders. Now, the sites that do have sheep bones, and I specifically look for sheep bones, so that's why I'm focusing on sheep right now. There was a couple of sherds with milk in them. So overall, can't determine if it was a herder occupied site on sites without domesticate bones or sheep or cattle bones. But if we do have sheep remains, then it's at least at the sites we analyzed, we did find evidence for milk being held in the pottery or processed at some point.
So that's really interesting. So there's such a nice correlation between the sheep bones and the milk and the pottery. From lipid analysis on ceramic shards, what are the kind of things you could expect to find? Obviously, milk being one of them, but I'm assuming it's also animal fat and various other items.
Yes. So milk, it was kind of, I don't know, like the unicorn to find, because ethnographic accounts do state that herders in the region during the later Stone Age used organic containers mostly to hold milk. So milk was, yeah, the unicorn. Other than that, we can really see bovid or kind of terrestrial, bovid fat. So that would be not just sheep and cows and goats, but it could be springbok or wildebeest or any of those types of that that are so prevalent in the region. So any of those types of mooey bovids that kind of roam around. So they could be wild or domesticates. So that's a little bit tricky. We need to use kind of special markers and targets to be able to differentiate between those species, which we haven't done yet. That's kind of the next step. So then on top of milk and kind of terrestrial mooey bovids, we also can determine some marine components. So we can at least, I guess it's, I want to say marine, but for our region it is, or for the region I work in, it is marine, but it's more broad than that. So there's also, you can also determine kind of in this broad category of non-terrestrial animals or non-bovide animals, you can determine fish consumption or fish fat, seal fat, plant compounds, shellfish, and in other parts of the world, it would be pigs and things like that, that we just don't see in Western South Africa during the later Stone Age in the archaeological record. So I ignore all the pigs, and it makes sense that it's likely shellfish or seals or fish or all of the above in the pot. And then again, to differentiate between those, you need to have really, you kind of have to have specific marine biomarkers to be able to differentiate what the lipid signals are coming out of those pots.
Okay, so you take the lipids, but then you have to look at these other biomarkers in order to really separate those lipids out.
Right. Okay. So you can get a general sense of like milk fats, and then kind of terrestrial, wild or domestic kind of bovids. And then there's kind of this other category of lipids that come off, in a different that you can determine as well.
And you mentioned the ethnographic record, and according to that, milk is being stored in organic containers. Is that like ostrich eggshell containers, or is it like more like satchel type things, or?
Yeah, so there's a variety that's been that have been mentioned. So organic, so it could be like the stomachs, the treated stomachs of animals that have been slaughtered. So you have kind of this calabash, I guess, thing that's lightweight and easy to kind of throw over your shoulder or onto animals. And then, some, I don't know if there's specifically ostrich eggshell evidence for using ostrich eggshells for milk at that time. But kind of other like hollowed out gourds, or I know there's some, these aren't kind of carrying, but to hold it in kind of these bowls, like a tortoiseshell bowl or things like that, where they would be using it. So it doesn't preserve very well in the archaeological record, those types of things. So
I see, Caruana, you've got a question there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Courtney. This sounds really, really interesting. And it sounds like you can gain a lot of information through analyzing lipids, which is quite cool. I was just wondering if you could give us a very brief rundown of some of the processes that you go through to sort of isolate lipids from a pot shard. Sorry, that's my inner lithicist coming out. Because I imagine it's quite sort of maybe chemistry heavy. And we don't really have a lot of people, doing that type of work that we've interviewed. So I think it would be quite interesting if you just gave us maybe a brief of sort of how that process works.
Of course, I'll do my very best. Although my collaborators at the University of Bristol are the ones that actually analyze and are really well versed in the chemistry, but I can try. Let's see where to start. So the different lipids, so really it's kind of tied to isotopes and or kind of the chemical compounds like that. So it's really kind of, we look at stearic acid and palmitic acid, bovids that kind of regurgitate their food and have a rumen. It's quite is their stearic to palmitic acid, these two lipids that we kind of at the very baseline look at, are more depleted in carbon than animals that do not have a rumen. So pigs, fish, seals. So I'm making this little graph in the screen here that might be a bit hard to see, but so we have the group of lipids that come off of the GCMS, or kind of the instrument that we use to visualize the peaks in lipids. For ruminants, so the bovidae guys, they come off somewhere in the middle because their carbon is more depleted in those lipids that we're looking for than animals that don't have a rumen. So they kind of sit further up on this graph. So that would be, all of the animals that don't ruminate. Then we have our ruminates. And then the palmitic and stearic acid are even more depleted in the mammary gland of mammals because it doesn't produce its own stearic or palmitic acid. So it becomes depleted as you metabolize all of these, or as the mother metabolizes all these kinds of lipids, and specifically the palmitic and stearic acid. And so those are the most depleted. So the milk from mammary glands are the most depleted, and they sit lowest kind of on the graph here. I'm just trying to visualize it. So we have kind of clumps that actually significantly are different from each other. And so we can, at the very base, determine whether it's milk, bovidy, ruminant fats, and then non-ruminant fats. Very briefly. Hopefully that makes sense. It's still something I'm trying to get a handle on myself in collaboration as I write my paper from the paper I gave at SAFA. So it's a bit different than isotopes. And so it's a bit of a learning curve to definitely fully understand what's going on with these lipids in our bodies or in the animals' bodies.
This is why we have collaborators, right? People who work on this stuff for a living who can help us out. So yeah,
I can't know everything, and I never would imagine that I could.
Thanks, Courtney. This is it's really interesting. But one question I do have is, how resistant are these organic compounds, these lipids, and how deep into the record can we actually go? How long do they preserve it? So you're talking about later Stone Age sites in the Namaqualand, but can we stretch into the MSA? Can we stretch it back even further? Sorry, Matt and I are coming in from an ESA perspective here, so we're always a little bit biased. I'm just a bit curious.
That is a good question. I don't know personally of any studies. I don't know if you find pottery or anything that's porous like that at your kind of the more earlier sites. I guess. So the short answer is I'm not sure how long they last, although they are more resistant to taphonomic processes, these lipids that are in the pottery, than like DNA or other things. It's kind of the same idea that zooms, or if you're looking at the zoo archaeology by mass spectrometry, that kind of preservation. So it'd be a fantastic experiment or to find out. So I guess at the start, I'll just kind of, I'm not sure, but nobody ever did the lipids or analyzed lipids from Namaqualand before. And so that was our first step initially, like, were they even preserved? What kind of preservation do we have in this desert environment where sand is scouring these potsherds? And we found that it's really quite well preserved overall. There is some contamination that we can account for from if samples are stored in plastic bags, that actually impacts the lipids and the readings from the instruments. So we actually did a pilot study before our main study just to determine whether, so you can, by using standards and everything, we can tell if it's well preserved or if it contains a lot of lipids or just a little bit of lipids in the pottery. So definitely if we find older potsherds, it'd be nice to test it out and see. You only need a very tiny amount, like just kind of a little Dremel of, the powder from the inside of the potsherd.
So that's the collection strategy. It's taking like a Dremel and just powdering out some of the ceramic and then examining that powder.
Yeah, so it has to be porous material. So once we get, into the historic period, or if we're looking at actually ceramics where they're heavily fired at a high temperature and glazed on the inside and the outside, then the lipids aren't going to kind of stick and embed themselves into the temper of the pottery. So we kind of need the less technological or less high temperature pottery to look at. So it has to be a bit porous, so the lipids can absorb, and you can't ever wash them out effectively if you're washing your dishes. So yeah, we need definitely a porous material on the inside of the pottery.
Okay. So earthenware, just what a brilliant sort of thing to do this with. Nice, porous, it's all over the place. It's abundant in many of these sites. So it's like a perfect sort of artifact.
Yeah.
So to kind of scale back a little bit to something you mentioned early on, I mean, it's such an interesting topic, is the sort of presence of herders, which is what you're trying to put your finger on here, is can we identify these people archaeologically? So just for the benefit of some of the listeners or viewers rather, what Why is it such an issue finding herders? What are our big challenges here?
That's a tricky situation. I don't want to upset people, but I think it's a number of reasons. I think historically, maybe archaeologists in the region have been looking in the wrong places. So we look at lots of coastal sites because we're looking at resource acquisition, and those are the most visible sites, these kind of stratified, either open air coastal sites or these stratified kind of shelter cave sites in the region. But so we're ignoring kind of these open air scatters of sites that are kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, kind of in the middle of nowhere. They do have a sense of place and time, but they aren't at the sites that maybe historically most archaeologists looking for herders might have thought, okay, herders are going to be kind of in the middle of this scrubby semi-arid desert, a little bit away from water, not by the ocean where there's lots of fatty resources that they can harvest. So I think that might be part of the reason. I think another reason could be if we think about East Africa, we think about large scale pastoralism where people are actually keeping a lot of domesticated animals, and their whole life way is centered around those animals, where at least early in the later Stone Age, or when herding was adopted in South Africa, I think it was much more low key or low scale. I don't think people kept these large cattle or cattle herds or even sheep herds. I think it was small scale, and they were highly mobile still. So I don't think that we're going to find sites that have all that to say that there's very few sites that have a lot of sheep bone or domesticate bone in the region. I also think part of the reason, finally, is that people weren't just slaughtering their animals. I think the animals provided a lot of other resources or reusable resources that people could access, whether that be milk, although it's hard to find some evidence. Ethnohistoric accounts differ on if milk was drank and by whom. But they also could have been used for trade and exchange. So kind of like the ostrich eggshell beads that we see. And so perhaps it was like, here I have 2 sheep, and you kind of trade them over kind of on the other side of the mountains. And then you have this kind of reciprocity that's happening. And so I think there's just a lot of things that people were using their herds for, and different herd management strategies throughout the region and probably throughout time as well. Yeah. And so I think that's why they're so elusive. Like they're there, but you just, it's tricky.
It is. And I think probably because it's tricky, it makes it such an interesting thing to look at. But also it's that needle in the haystack type scenario. Like, you know, in so many of our landscapes, you've got these markers that may indicate herders, like rock art or some nice sheep bones at a site, but it might just be 1 or 2 or a handful of them. But a lot of it isn't really hammering down like definitively we've got them here. You know, like it's difficult, and I think that sort of like the allure of the chase in a sense, you know, to try and find the evidence of a very enigmatic group of people.
Right, but that were so important. And like, I guess like our overarching question is, why would mobile people who could carry their water with them for themselves and their family group decide to tether themselves to these drought intolerant animals? And then once they did, how did they mitigate the risks of doing that? And so I think those are really just the resiliency of the people living in Namaqualand, adopting herding from a really more even mobile hunter-gatherer or forager lifestyle. And then now they're becoming a bit more tethered to water sources. So kudos to wanting to do that, because when we excavate in the region, we have to haul water from a very long distance to be able to cook and drink and eat. So
Amazing. Lotta, I see you've got a question.
It's actually more just an observation. earlier on, Courtney, when you were talking about the different kind of lipid evidence that you've got, fish, seal, plant, shellfish, to me that really talks to subsistence variability. And you mentioned now about how they would tether themselves to these drought-resistant animals and stuff. But it really seems like there is a very kind of adaptive strategy or adaptive mentality, and populations would have been moving across the landscape looking for these different food sources to hold themselves over through different seasonal periods.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So I think that's how they did mitigate these risks of keeping these animals. A, they didn't keep a lot of them and they were used for all different purposes. And then B, yeah, they were using all sorts of different resources. So up along the Orange River in the far northwest of the country, we see sites where they're harvesting lots and lots of fish. And these are herders. So they're supplementing their diet with this fatty, nutritious fish, where maybe on the West Coast, on the Atlantic coast, we see more seal harvesting. There's been, we think is a herder site that is a seal mass harvesting site. And so really they're supplementing their diet and their subsistence strategy, and sheep, in my case, sheep specifically, don't form the kind of surrounding of their lifeway or their subsistence strategy. They're there in low numbers, I think. And they are important, obviously, because people are still keeping them in the semi-arid desert, but they're not just saying, okay, we're going to slaughter a sheep every day for our subsistence. They actually have a different herd management strategy that's happening that's not subsistence based. It's more social based, I think, whether that be ritual or ceremonial or yearly events or trading with neighbors.
It's amazing. I mean, I was in December, I was in the Richtersveld area where there's still a lot of communities up there practicing herding. Obviously, they're quite sedentary now. But what struck me was the dependence on the Orange River and how many fishing areas there were, those like rock-built fishing capture areas. It was incredible. And a lot of people moving to and fro across the landscape with livestock and then fishing along the Orange River. It was fascinating, actually. And I thought it's like a crazily marginal landscape, but people make a huge success of it, and a highly adaptable, it's amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Like in where we work out in the Spitzkloof River Valley, the nearest town is about 30 kilometers away, or village, Leckersing, and still modern day herders move their sheep through that river valley. So it's like this enduring subsistence and kind of, practice that is still occurring to this day. And it's really, I find it really cool. I don't like that people are still practicing this in a region that really has never been substantially or significantly wetter or more productive than it is today.
Yeah.
So since the Miocene, at least.
Yeah, and what we're talking about all of this, a lot of the routes that people expect herders to have entered into this region is a lot of the maps are talking about coming down into northern South Africa through the Zimbabwe-Botswana border area. So it's entering down further south from there into, you'd imagine, landscapes that are far easier to live on, but ultimately arriving in these very dry areas of Namibia and the Northern Cape.
Right. Yeah. Following the Orange River, definitely along that western front. Between of borders, which weren't there at that time.
Yeah, sure.
Are now,
yeah. Well, it's such an interesting topic, and it's something to really ponder. And I think we're probably going to be wondering about these things for a long time to come still, and the debates that surround, identifying herders are fascinating reads, and I get quite fired up at times. But Courtney, I think we'd sort of wrap it up there. And thanks so much for joining us. We really probably could sit here and talk more. It's so interesting. But we do appreciate you taking the time and sharing your research with us and your paper. Good luck finishing up. And hopefully you'll be able to come back here and we can maybe have a beer and talk more about lipids and POTS and things like that.
I'd be happy to. I have samples waiting at UCT that once the pandemic is settled down, hopefully I can make it back there. So thank you all for having me. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on.